The Jest Festival was a great success this year. Despite the limitations caused by the pandemic, Helen True, the Dünzkofer Festival's program director, with the help of Janet Rennie and other members of the board, put together a wonderful program, which not only was thought-provoking in its own right, but it also made me look forward to the 2021 edition of the Just Festival, when we'll hopefully be doing a festival that resembles the past 18 years, rather than this year. Last Tuesday, the Just Festival hosted a conversation amongst 4 Black Scots, and they discussed the question, do Black lives matter in Scotland? It was an intriguing and challenging conversation, which I highly recommend to you. You will be able to access it on the Just Festival's website soon. What really surprised me in the conversation were the accents. There were Black people on my screen, and they were all speaking with a Scottish accent. Of course they were, because they are as Scottish as haggis, ochtamachty, Nahelian shear, and midgets. What was I expecting? Really, what was I expecting? It was a reminder that I still have work to do when it comes to my own prejudices and my internalized racism. Yes, I should have known better. I speak with a non-Scottish accent because, well, I wasn't born here, but I now call Scotland home, a home I love and love to live in. And so do the panelists on Tuesday. But unfortunately, this love for Scotland has not always meant either of us are accepted as Scots. Far too often, we are viewed as non-Scot, as alien, as other. And strangely enough, those 4 BAME Scots born here have to face this more so than I, who was not born here. Yes, I have experienced xenophobia and prejudices even in the Scottish Church, but my experiences are absolutely small compared to what we heard on Tuesday evening. Unfortunately, for many people, Scotland is about kilts on white dudes with Scottish accents. It's what gets many a woman and many a man melting like a Mars bar into its batter. But Mars bars might be the only black allowed in some folks' understanding of Scottish culture. Black skin on human beings, well, that is another issue. As I said, it's seen as alien, other. The Hebrews we hear about in the book of Exodus, who had made Egypt their home, were also viewed as alien and other, as not quite Egyptian enough. They had not been in the land long enough. Maybe they spoke with an accent. Maybe they just didn't speak Egyptian at all. They worshipped an alien god. Their complexion was different. And they had not attended the right schools. Sorry, I know this is an anachronistic reference. Obviously, I was confusing my place names starting with E. We have to acknowledge, though, for most part, Egyptians, of course, were ordinary people. They went about life no different than other people. They were not any meaner, any more evil, any more corrupt, any more racist than others. There were bad Egyptians, of course, and there were also good, very good Egyptians too. And still, somehow Pharaoh was able to dip into their psyche, to manipulate them so that they succumbed all of a sudden to mass hysteria, to mass racism, to mass sin. They exerted their power and their might. Instead of embracing what the Hebrews had to offer, they enslaved them. Injustice and oppression had become the watchword of the land. Maybe it was just a power game. Maybe it was blatant racism. Be that as it may, what had darkened Pharaoh's soul and what had turned his heart into stone was a lethal combination of narcissistic self-aggrandizement on the one hand and fear on the other. This is a combination that seems to be at the heart of most problems in human history as much as in our personal history as well. When we think we are better than others, and when we can think we can do it alone without referring and deferring to the source of all being, then trouble starts. And once fear is added, darkness and death warm up for their demonic dance, dishing out destruction with delight. And this is not just true for the book of Exodus. Over-glorification of oneself, one's clan, one's tribe, one's religion, and one's nation, combined with fear of the other, would eventually lead to the great, horrid, and unparalleled evils of the Third Reich. Hitler was another Pharaoh who could not stand the Hebrews and any others who were different. Racism is not just a casual sin. It is a great evil, and it is an evil that seems to have been with us for, well, ever. Somehow we cannot understand that the genetic difference between us is less than 0.1%, and it really doesn't matter what color skin we have. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same disease, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? This is how the great bard versified it. And yet, even the Merchant of Venice avails itself of stereotypes that make us cringe today. Even Shakespeare seems to have forgotten that each and every one of us carries divinely willed beauty in our hearts and souls, and that each and every one of us is created in the image of God. Ah, God. Yes, I haven't forgotten that this is a sermon rather than a party political broadcast. God is still very much the subject here. Yes, I mean subject, not object. Because God doesn't stand idly by. God hears the cries of the Hebrews, of Jews throughout the ages. God hears the cries of those dehumanized in the slave triangle. God hears the cries of those shot in Amritsar until ammunition runs out. God hears the cries of those engulfed in flames in Nanjing. God hears the cries of those lost on the trail of tears. God hears the cries of those raped and brutalized by the Wehrmacht. God hears the cries of those gassed in extermination camps. God hears the cries of those starved in POW camps in the Pacific. God hears the cries obliterated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. God hears the cries of those chained for being Uyghur Muslims. God hears the cries of refugees braving the Channel. God hears the cries of those who cannot breathe. And God doesn't just listen. God does not abandon those who cry. But God is not Pharaoh. God does not participate in our power games, does not play according to our rules. But God interacts in surprising ways, in non-human ways. And God does so that we see that God's reality is radically different from ours. God turns our reality upside down, often moving those on the margins of our hierarchies to the center of God's salvation story. More than once, it's a wee bairn or a woman or both whom God chooses to bring about the downfall of oppression and injustice, the downfall of rebellion against God's will and God's majesty, the downfall of sin and evil in our personal lives as much as in the life of society. The real power in our story is not wielded by those who have whips. It is not exercised by the Egyptian taskmasters. God vests real power in the compassion of a mother, of midwives, of a sister, and of an Egyptian princess that becomes a foster mother. Creed and ethnicity, and even age, do not matter as God brings about liberation, blowing apart our assumptions, our privileges, and our way of running the show. And of course, the story has already overtones of that moment when God's love becomes flesh, born of our sister Mary, and irrevocably piercing the darkness, any darkness, and irrevocably offering liberation for all. Yes, racism is still very much with us, and it's strong. Yes, overconfidence and self-reliant egoism is still with us, and it is strong. Yes, fear is still with us, and not just in these insecure pandemic days. And it too is very strong. But the book of Exodus reminds us that compassion is stronger still. And it reminds us that in siding with compassion and love, even love for our enemies, we side with the living God, whose compassion and love indeed will have the final word.